A poor girl helps a millionaire whose car broke down on the road, not knowing his true identity. The next day, when she turned on the TV, and then the sun hung low over the countryside, its rays casting an amber glow across the endless rows of cornfields swaying gently in the evening breeze. Cicero's quiet was deceptive, serene on the surface, but laced with the expectancy of a coming storm. Clouds gathered on the horizon, their edges dark and swollen. With a sharp hiss of frustration escaping his teeth, David Shelton rolled his motorcycle to the shoulder of the deserted road. The engine had coughed its last breath miles ago, sputtering into silence as he crested the last hill. Now, as he stood over the battered machine, its once shiny chrome dulled with dust from the ride, he realized the futility of the situation. Having grown up in the city, he had a limited understanding of the beast's mechanics. The first fat drop of rain hit his cheek as he crouched to inspect the problem. It wasn't just the engine, it was the chain too, slack and dislodged like a forgotten promise. He straightened, running a hand through his wind-tousled hair, and glanced at his phone. No bars. Of course. His sleek leather jacket, subtly tailored, felt oppressive in the rising humidity. Perfect, he muttered under his breath, his words swallowed by the low rumble of thunder. He leaned against the motorcycle, squinting at the endless stretch of empty road ahead. Cicero, this sleepy pocket of nowhere, suddenly felt like an unwelcoming host. A rumbling engine broke the silence, a noise grating yet oddly comforting. He turned toward the sound, just as a rusted pickup truck came into view, chugging along the gravel path. Its headlights flickered like fireflies in the growing gloom. The truck slowed and the window rolled down, revealing a woman in her late 20s. Her auburn hair was tied back in a haphazard ponytail, and her face bore the unmistakable smudge of grease near her temple. "You look like you could use some help," she called out, her tone casual but sharp with observation. David straightened, brushing off his jacket instinctively. "That obvious, huh?" Her lips quirked into a faint smirk. "Let me guess. Engine trouble?" "That and the chain," he admitted, gesturing to the sagging mess. "I was hoping to make it to town before this storm decided to get serious." The woman's gaze swept over him, lingering for a fraction longer than politeness required. There was something about his tailored jacket and polished boots that didn't quite fit the setting. "Not from around here, are you?" she asked. "Just passing through," David replied quickly, an edge of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Needed a break from the city?" "Right." She tilted her head toward the bike. "Well, you're not going anywhere on that. Mind if I take a look? You know about bikes?" His surprise was poorly masked, and it earned him a raised eyebrow. "Grew up in a garage," she said, hopping down from the truck. Her boots hit the gravel with a solid thunk. "I've been fixing engines longer than you've probably been riding them." David blinked, then stepped aside. "Be my guest." The woman crouched beside the bike, her movements precise and efficient. The chain was the first thing she examined, her fingers deftly assessing the damage. "Loose sprocket," she muttered. "You're lucky this didn't snap while you were riding. Could have sent you flying." Her words lingered in the atmosphere, imbued with a blend of caution and indifference. She worked quickly, pulling a wrench from a well-worn toolbox in her truck bed. David watched, equal parts impressed and uneasy. "So," she said after a moment, breaking the silence, "what's your name, city boy?" "David," he replied. "And you?" "Alexis," she said simply, tightening the chain with a firm twist. "And you might want to consider carrying a basic toolkit if you're planning to wander the countryside. Not every breakdown occurs with such luck." "I'll keep that in mind," David said, his tone dry. He shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing away as her eyes flicked up to meet his. Alexis's gaze lingered on his jacket for a moment, sharp and assessing. "What kind of work do you do, David?" He hesitated, too long for it to go unnoticed. "Office stuff, nothing exciting." Her smirk returned, faint but knowing. "Uh-huh." She straightened, dusting her hands on her jeans. "Well, whether it's for office work or not, your bike is in good condition for the time being. Just don't push it too hard before getting a proper tune-up." David nodded, grateful despite the strange tension in her tone. "How much do I owe you?" Alexis waved him off. "Don't worry about it. Just helping out a fellow traveler." As she climbed back into her truck, David called after her, "At least let me buy you dinner sometime." Alexis paused, one hand on the wheel. Her green eyes met his, glinting with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "Maybe, if you make it to town without breaking down again." With that, she drove off, leaving David standing beside his bike as the first true crack of thunder echoed across the fields. Something about her lingered in his mind as he restarted the engine and rode toward Cicero, the storm chasing close behind. The bell above the diner door jingled as David stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried food wrapping around him like a warm quilt. Cicero's diner was a small, unassuming place, its checkered floor scuffed from years of boots and sneakers, its booths well worn, but inviting. A few patrons lingered over plates of pie, their conversations a low murmur beneath the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. David scanned the room, and his gaze landed on her. Alexis was perched at the counter, one boot hooked on the rung of her stool, her elbow propped casually on the counter as she thumbed through a dog-eared magazine. She looked as comfortable here as she had on the side of the road, her hair still tied back, grease stains faint, but visible on her t-shirt. He hesitated, unsure if he was overstepping, but the memory of her quick wit and calm efficiency pulled him forward, the seat beside her suddenly the only place in the room worth sitting. "City boy," she said, without looking up, a slight smile curving her lips. "Lost again?" David chuckled as he slid onto the stool next to her. "Not this time. Figured I'd try the local cuisine before I head back." Alexis closed the magazine, her green eyes meeting his. "This your idea of a 5-star meal?" "Depends. What's the special?" She smirked, leaning back slightly. "Meatloaf. Edible if you're lucky." He grinned, signaling the waitress. "I'll take my chances." The waitress jotted down his order, refilling Alexis's chipped coffee mug without a word. The two of them sat in companionable silence for a moment, the hum of the diner filling the space. David stole a glance at her, noting the easy way she fit into the scene, like she belonged to this place in a way he never had to any. "So," he began, folding his hands on the counter, "what does a small-town mechanic do for fun?" Alexis snorted softly. "Fun's a luxury. Between the garage and keeping my dad out of trouble, there's not much time for it." "Your dad?" he prompted, genuinely curious. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze softening slightly. "Russell, he owns the garage. Taught me everything I know. These days, though..." She trailed off, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "He's not as spry as he used to be. I've been running the place more and more." "Sounds like a lot to handle," David said, keeping his tone light, though the weight of her words lingered. "It is," she admitted, but there was no self-pity in her voice. "But it's home. It's what we do." Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the fading light cast long shadows across the parking lot. "Cicero might not look like much, but it's got heart. People here take care of each other. It's why I stayed, I guess." David followed her gaze, the words settling between them. He could feel her pride in this small town, her loyalty to the people and the life she'd built. It was foreign to him, this kind of rootedness, but something about it felt steady, solid. "And you?" Alexis asked, turning back to him. "What's your story? City boy. What's so bad about the big city that you had to escape out here? The question was casual, but there was an edge of curiosity in her tone. David hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Just needed a break, he said vaguely. Work's been intense. Alexis raised an eyebrow. What kind of work? Office stuff, normal and boring. You know, emails, spreadsheets, meetings. Nothing exciting. She studied him for a moment, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to peel back the layers of his answer. Huh, she said finally, her tone neutral. Doesn't sound like something that'd drive a guy to the middle of nowhere. David chuckled, deflecting. Maybe I just like the scenery. Her smirk returned, but she didn't press further. Well, enjoy it while you can. Cicero's not exactly buzzing with excitement, but it grows on you. They delved into lighter topics, such as her preferred hiking locations, the top-notch pies in town, and the peculiarities of small-town living. David found himself laughing more than he had in months, as the tension of his carefully crafted persona gradually dissipated. When his food arrived, Alexis slid off her stool, tossing a few bills on the counter. Guess I'll see you around, city boy, she said, her voice teasing but warm. Count on it, he replied, watching as she strode out the door, her boots clicking softly against the tiles. As the bell jingled behind her, David felt a strange sense of loss. He poked at his meatloaf, the conversation replaying in his mind. Alexis was sharp, grounded, and unapologetically herself, a stark contrast to the polished facades he was used to. David wondered if the version of himself he'd shown her was enough to keep her interest, or if the truth, lurking beneath, would undo everything they'd begun to build. The streetlights of Cicero flickered to life, their soft glow reflecting off the still pavement as David stepped out of the diner. The meatloaf had been passable, but the company had been unforgettable. He glanced at his motorcycle parked nearby, the engine repaired, but his thoughts in disarray. Heading back to the city felt unappealing, the prospect of towering glass buildings and endless demands paling in comparison to the quiet charm of this small town. Change of plans, a familiar voice called from across the lot. Alexis leaned against her truck, her arms crossed and a slight smirk tugging at her lips. David hesitated, caught between the impulse to leave and the strange pull this woman seemed to have on him. Finally he shrugged. I decided to take the picturesque path before returning. She tilted her head, her expression hovering between amusement and skepticism. Scenic, huh? There's not much to see once it gets dark. Then I'm lucky I bumped into the local expert, he replied, taking a few steps toward her. Care to give me a tour? Alexis rolled her eyes, but climbed into her truck. Follow me, city boy. Let's see if you can keep up. The drive was short but winding, the roads narrowing as the trees thickened. David followed Alexis's taillights closely, the hum of his motorcycle steady against the distant sound of crickets. When they stopped, it was at a gravel lot near a small clearing. Alexis was already out of her truck, a flashlight in hand. Come on, she said, nodding toward a barely visible path. This way. David dismounted and fell into step beside her, the beam of her flashlight illuminating the dirt trail. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze was soothing. Alexis walked confidently, her boots crunching against the path. He noted the ease in her stride, the way she seemed to belong here. This is where I come when I need to clear my head, she said after a few moments, her voice quieter than usual. Not much, but it gets the job done. As they emerged from the trees, David understood what she meant. The overlook stretched wide before them, the town of Cicero twinkling below like a scattering of fireflies. The stars above were brighter than he'd ever seen, untainted by the light pollution of the city. The world felt expansive, yet intimate. The kind of place where secrets could linger without judgment. "It's beautiful," David murmured, genuinely awed. Alexis leaned against the wooden railing, her arms resting on the weathered wood. "It's home," she said simply. "Not perfect, but it's got its moments." David joined her, the night air cool against his skin. "I can see why you stayed." Alexis glanced at him, her eyes curious. "And you? What are you running from?" Her inquiry pierced the silence with a sharp edge. David hesitated, his grip tightening on the railing. "Who says I'm running?" he countered, attempting a lightness that fell flat. Alexis didn't press, but the weight of her silence was palpable. "You don't have to tell me," she said after a moment. "But whatever it is, it's following you. People don't just show up in places like Cicero without a reason." David exhaled, the tightness in his chest growing. "I wanted space," he admitted finally, his gaze fixed on the town below. "A chance to breathe." Alexis nodded, her expression softening. "Well, you found it." They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of the night filling the gaps in their conversation. David found himself watching Alexis out of the corner of his eye, the way her hair caught the faint starlight, the way her shoulders relaxed, as if the weight of the world couldn't touch her here. She was everything his life wasn't. Grounded, unpretentious, real. "You're lucky," he said softly, "to have all this." Alexis smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Lucky is one way to put it, but it's not always easy. Running the garage, looking after my dad. Sometimes it feels like there's not much room left for me." "Why do you do it then?" David asked, genuinely curious. "Because it's worth it," she replied, her voice steady. "This town, my dad, the people, they're worth it. And if you find something worth holding on to, you don't let it go, no matter how hard it gets." Her words hit David, harder than he expected, a pang of guilt twisting in his chest. The version of himself he'd shown her, just a guy on a motorcycle, escaping the grind, wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. And here she was, exposing herself, putting her trust in him in a manner he wasn't certain he deserved. "I admire that," he whispered softly. Alexis glanced at him, her lips curving into a small, genuine smile. "Thanks, city boy." As they turned to leave, the path back to their vehicles seemed longer, the quiet between them heavier. David's mind churned, the weight of his secret pressing harder with each step. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, inevitable and unforgiving, would change everything. The cafe was quiet, except for the low hum of conversation and the occasional clang of a coffee cup meeting a saucer. David stirred his tea absent-mindedly, his eyes on Alexis as she leaned back in her chair. The warm light softened her features, and for a moment he forgot about the unease gnawing at him. "This place has character," David said, gesturing to the framed photos on the walls. Snapshots of Cicero through the years, its people, its moments. Alexis smirked. "It's a polite way of saying it's old." "No," he replied quickly, his tone genuine. "It feels lived in, like it's part of something bigger." Alexis tilted her head, studying him with a trace of amusement. "You have a way with words, city boy. Makes me wonder what you actually do for a living." David's heart stumbled. He leaned back, forcing a grin. "Told you, office stuff, nothing exciting." Her eyes narrowed, but before she could press further, the cafe's television flickered, catching both their attention. The volume, low but clear, carried the smooth voice of a news anchor. And, in business news, Shelton Enterprises CEO David Shelton has finalized the acquisition of Syntech Industries, solidifying his position as one of the country's leading entrepreneurs. The words struck David with a forceful impact. His gaze darted to the screen, where his face, polished, corporate, unmistakable, filled the frame. The room seemed to still, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Alexis sat frozen, her eyes glued to the television. The image changed to footage of a press conference. David, in a sharp suit, shaking hands with executives, flashing a smile that seemed worlds away from the man sitting across from her now. David Shelton couldn't be reached for comment, the anchor continued, but sources suggest this move will revolutionize the tech landscape. The TV clicked off abruptly, the barista muttering an apology about the noise. But the silence that followed was deafening. Alexis turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Shelton Enterprises," she said slowly, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "That's you?" David swallowed hard, his hands tightening around his teacup. "Alexis, let me explain." She cut him off, her chair scraping against the floor as she stood. "Explain what, exactly? That you've been lying to me since the moment we met." "I wasn't lying," he said quickly, rising to his feet. Just what?" Her voice rose, drawing the attention of the other patrons. She didn't seem to care. "Decided to pretend to be someone else. To what? Play the part of the down-to-earth guy while secretly scoping out my town for some business venture?" His stomach sank. "That's not it at all." "Then what is it?" she demanded, her eyes blazing. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you're just another rich guy thinking you can come in here, throw some money around, and take whatever you want." "Alexis, I would never." He reached for her, but she stepped back, her movements stiff, her face a mask of betrayal. She spoke, her voice cracking. "People like you appear, full of promise, and then abandon the rest of us to bear the consequences. I thought you were different." "I am different," David insisted, his own voice rising now. "Everything I told you, about needing space, about wanting something real. It was the truth. But you left out the part where you're a multi-millionaire CEO," she shot back. "Kind of an important detail, don't you think?" He faltered, the weight of her accusation bearing down on him. "I didn't want that to define how you saw me," he said quietly. "I wanted you to know me first." Alexis's laugh was bitter, cutting. "Well, congratulations. I know you now." She turned and strode toward the door, her boots echoing against the floor. David followed, his pulse pounding. "Alexis, please," he called after her. "Let me make this right." She paused at the threshold, her hand on the door. For a moment, he thought she might turn back. But when she spoke, her voice was cold. "You want to make it right," she said, not looking at him. "Leave my town alone, and leave me alone." Alexis pushed open the cafe door, the bell jingling behind her as she stepped into the cool evening air. Her boots hit the pavement with a force that mirrored her swirling emotions. David followed a few paces behind, his voice soft but urgent. "Alexis, please," he began. But the tension in her rigid shoulders warned him not to push too hard. Before they could continue their conversation, a sleek black sedan arrived at the curb. A woman in a crisp blazer stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her professional demeanor contrasted starkly with the quiet charm of Cicero's streets. "Mr. Shelton," the woman said, her eyes briefly flicking to Alexis before locking on David. "You're behind schedule. The Syntech deal requires your signature by morning and—" She paused, glancing at the motorcycle parked nearby, her tone tinged with confusion. "You arrived here on that?" Alexis froze, her chest tightening. She didn't need to hear the rest to feel the invisible line being drawn between them, sharp and impenetrable. "Claire," David said quickly, his voice laced with frustration. "Not now. Claire hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Of course, sir. I'll wait in the car." Alexis turned to David, her jaw tight, her voice low and unsteady. "Your assistant, your business deals, your fancy cars. It all fits, doesn't it? And here I thought you might actually belong in a place like this." "Alexis, it's not like that," David said, stepping toward her, his hands raised in a plea. "You never meant for me to find out," she interrupted, her tone bitter. "But I did. And now it's painfully clear how different we are." She didn't wait for his reply. Instead, she turned and briskly walked toward her truck, leaving David frozen in place, watching as she vanished into the night. The sound of a wrench clattering against the concrete floor echoed through Alexis's garage. She muttered a curse under her breath, shaking out her hand after the misstep. The afternoon sun filtered through the wide garage doors, highlighting the dust particles swirling lazily in the air. Outside, the faint chatter of townsfolk carried in the wind, but inside, the space was heavy with tension. Alexis maintained a razor-sharp focus. Every bolt tightened, every smudge wiped clean, every engine tuned with precision that left no room for wandering thoughts. She welcomed the distraction. The rhythmic grind of her tools drowned out the gnawing questions, the anger that still simmered days after that night at the cafe. Her father, Russell, shuffled in from the office, his gait slower than it used to be. "You've been at it for hours," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Take a break, Em." "I'm fine," she replied curtly, not looking up from the carburetor in her hands. Russell sighed, leaning against the workbench. "It's about that city boy, isn't it?" Alexis stiffened, but didn't respond. She felt her father's gaze linger on her, heavy and knowing, before he finally retreated back to the office. Once alone, she exhaled sharply, setting the carburetor down with more force than necessary. Meanwhile, in Chicago, David sat in his expansive penthouse, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But he barely noticed. The once alluring sight of the bustling metropolis now felt hollow, lifeless. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the dim light. On the coffee table, his phone buzzed with another missed call from his assistant, no doubt about the Syntec merger. He ignored it, as he had ignored most things since returning from Cicero. Instead, his mind replayed the moments with Alexis, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her town, the warmth in her laugh, the steel in her gaze when she realized who he was. He had thought he was protecting something fragile, nurturing a connection that was more real than anything he'd experienced. But now, all he could see was the wreckage of his choices. "Sir?" came a hesitant voice from the doorway. His assistant, Claire, stood holding a tablet. "You have a meeting in an hour. And there's something else. Thomas Price is requesting an update on the Cicero project." At the mention of Cicero, David's head snapped up. "What project?" Claire shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas has been looking into acquiring some properties there. He says it's a promising location for the new factory." David stood abruptly, the glass in his hand forgotten as it hit the counter with a muted thud. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tell him I want nothing to do with that. I'll handle it." Claire nodded quickly and left, sensing the tension in the room. David rubbed his temples, the pieces falling into place. Thomas's interest in Cicero wasn't new, but it had slipped under David's radar amidst the chaos of the merger. And now, he was certain, Thomas wouldn't hesitate to exploit any leverage he could find, including Alexis. Back in Cicero, the hum of a sleek black car broke the quiet morning air. Alexis glanced up from under the hood of a pickup, her brows knitting together as the vehicle rolled into the garage lot. The car stood out in this garage lot, its shine almost offensive against the backdrop of oil stains and rusted tools. The man who emerged was even more unexpected. Dressed in an immaculate suit, Thomas Price exuded a confidence that immediately set Alexis on edge. He adjusted his tie, his sharp features twisting into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Wagner," he began smoothly, his gaze sweeping the garage. "What a charming little operation you've got here." Alexis straightened, wiping her hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" Thomas's smile widened. "I believe you can. I'm here to discuss an opportunity, one that could be quite lucrative for you and your father." She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "We're not interested." "You haven't even heard my offer," he replied, unfazed. "My company is looking to invest in this area. Of course, that means some changes, new infrastructure, jobs, and progress." "And by progress you mean tearing down half the town?" she shot back. Thomas's expression hardened for a moment before the smile returned. "Let's not be dramatic. I'm simply proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. Your garage sits on prime real estate, valuable for both of us." Alexis stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "This garage is more than real estate. It's my family's livelihood. And it's not for sale." Thomas tilted his head, studying her. "I'd think carefully about that, Miss Wagner. Opportunities like this don't come around often." Before she could respond, another car pulled into the lot, the familiar rumble causing her breath to hitch. David stepped out, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his expression stormy as his eyes locked onto Thomas. "What are you doing here, Price?" David's voice sliced through the tension with a sharp edge. Thomas turned slowly, his smile faltering for the first time. "Just a friendly business visit," he said coolly. David stepped between Thomas and Alexis, his presence unmistakably protective. "Stay away from this town, and from her." Alexis stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and something she wasn't ready to name. But as Thomas retreated, his parting words lingered ominously. "This isn't over." David turned to Alexis, his eyes filled with guilt and resolve. "We need to talk," he said softly. But Alexis's walls were firmly up, her voice sharp. "Haven't you done enough?" This time David realized that fixing this wouldn't just take words, it would take everything he had. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across Cicero as David turned onto the familiar road leading to Alexis's garage. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind rehearsing apologies, explanations, and pleas. Tonight, he wasn't leaving without speaking to her, no matter how angry she was. He owed her that much, and more. It's been 2 weeks since they last met. At the same time, the dusky light bathed the garage in muted oranges and purples as Alexis leaned against the workbench, her hands smudged with grease. Dear listeners, do you come from a big, bustling city or a quiet suburb? Why don't you tell us where you live? Leave a comment saying night if you're from the city and day if you're from the countryside. Wherever you are, it's a great place. The rhythmic clang of tools punctuated the quiet hum of the approaching evening, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Russell shuffled near the entrance, sorting through old invoices, his movements slower than usual. Suddenly, the growl of multiple engines cut through the silence. Alexis looked up, frowning as 2 black SUVs pulled into the lot, their sleek bodies out of place against the worn-down charm of Cicero. Men in sharp suits stepped out, their polished shoes crunching on the gravel, their postures rigid with purpose. "Miss Wagner," one of them called, his voice cold and formal. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Price. He'd like you to reconsider his offer." Alexis straightened, her stance firm, despite the unease curling in her stomach. "I told him already. We're not interested. You're wasting your time." The man took a step closer, his smile a thin veneer of civility. "Let's not make this difficult. Mr. Price is quite insistent, and we wouldn't want things to get unpleasant." Russell appeared in the doorway, his weathered face hardening as he took in the scene. "You heard her. We're not selling. Now get off our property before I call the sheriff." The leader of the group chuckled darkly, glancing back at his men. "The sheriff can't stop progress, old man. You'd be wise to step aside." Before Alexis could respond, the sound of an engine cut through the tension. Upon arriving at the gravel lot, the sight before David shivered through his spine. Two burly men in dark clothing stood in the middle of the garage, their intimidating postures dwarfing Russell, who stood with his arms crossed but with clear tension in his weathered face. Alexis was nearby, her expression a mix of defiance and unease as she stood between her father and the men. David's heart lurched. Without thinking, he killed the engine and stepped out of his car. "What's going on here?" His voice cut through the dusk, sharp and commanding. The larger of the two men turned, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Who's this?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward David. "Doesn't matter," Alexis snapped, stepping forward. "You've delivered your message. Now get out." The man chuckled, a sound that grated against the stillness of the evening. "We're just having a friendly chat. No harm in that, is there?" David strode forward, his jaw tight. "I'd say there's plenty of harm in threatening people on their own property." The man's demeanor shifted, irritation flickering in his eyes. "We don't want trouble." "Then leave," David said, his voice steady but firm. He moved to stand beside Alexis, his presence a silent shield. "Or what?" the second man sneered, stepping forward. Before David could respond, the situation escalated. One of the men reached out, grabbing David by the jacket and yanking him back. Instinctively, David swung, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a satisfying thud. Chaos erupted. Alexis shouted something, but it was drowned out by the scuffle. Russell lunged forward to help, but the other man pushed him back. David, outnumbered and unarmed, held his ground, his movements quick but untrained. A blow landed squarely on his ribs, sending him stumbling. "Stop it!" Alexis yelled, her voice cracking as she grabbed a nearby wrench. She swung it in the air, her desperation evident. "I said stop!" The men hesitated, their eyes darting between her and the crumpled figure of David on the ground. One of them muttered something about it not being worth the trouble. With a glare, they stepped back. "This isn't over," one of them spat, his gaze lingering on Alexis, before they retreated to their car and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Alexis dropped the wrench, breathing in short gasps. She turned to David, who was attempting to sit up, wincing with every movement. "You idiot," she muttered, dropping to her knees beside him. "What were you thinking?" David looked up at her, his face pale but determined. "I was thinking, they weren't going to hurt you. Or Russell." Alexis's chest tightened as she took in the sight of him. His disheveled hair, the blood trickling from the corner of his lip, the way he refused to let the pain show in his expression. She wanted to yell at him, to push him away, to pull him closer. "Can you stand?" she asked instead, her tone softer now. "With some help," he admitted, managing a weak smile. Alexis slipped an arm under his, helping him to his feet. Russell hurried over, his face lined with worry. "Inside," Alexis said firmly. "Now." As they guided David into the garage, Alexis's mind raced. The sight of him intervening without hesitation to protect her and her father had unsettled her deeply. But the anger she carried, the betrayal she still felt, remained, tangled with a growing sense of confusion. For the first time, she wasn't sure where to place him, the man she couldn't trust, or the man who had risked everything to protect her. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the small hospital room. where the rhythmic beeping of a monitor punctuated the stillness. David lay on the bed, his face pale but composed, a bandage wrapped tightly around his ribs. Alexis sat in a chair by the window, her arms crossed, staring out at the parking lot below. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived, her emotions a swirling mix of anger, guilt, and something softer she refused to name. The door creaked open, and Russell stepped in, a styrofoam cup of coffee in hand. "You should get some rest, Em," he said gruffly, setting the cup on the windowsill. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice sharper than intended. Russell gave her a long look, but didn't press. He turned his attention to David, whose eyes flickered open at the sound of their voices. "How's the hero doing?" Russell asked, his tone dry, but not unkind. David muttered, trying to smile. "Seen better days. But it's worth it." Alexis shot him a glance, but said nothing. The tension between them was palpable, filling the room like a heavy fog. Before anyone could speak again, the door opened once more, and a poised woman stepped inside. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly styled, her tailored coat pristine despite the late hour. Alexis recognized her immediately from the press photos. Helen Shelton. Helen's eyes scanned the room, her gaze landing on Alexis and Russell. "I'm Helen," she introduced herself, her voice warm but steady. "David's mother. I came as soon as I heard." Alexis's throat tightened, but it was Russell who spoke first. "Helen," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something unspoken. Helen's composed expression faltered slightly as she turned to him. "Russell." The weight of years seemed to hang between them, an invisible thread tugging at memories neither had expected to revisit. Alexis, sensing the shift, glanced between them, her curiosity piqued. Before she could speak, a nurse appeared, gesturing toward Helen. "You can see him now, Mrs. Shelton," the nurse said. Helen hesitated, her eyes lingering on Russell before nodding and following the nurse. Later, Alexis excused herself to get coffee, leaving Russell alone in the waiting room. Helen returned a moment later, her steps hesitant. She sat down beside Russell, the silence between them stretching taut. "It's been a long time," Helen said finally, her voice quiet. Russell nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," she admitted. "But David, he's always been stubborn, just like his father." Russell's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Seems like he got more than that from you." They lapsed into silence again, the years of distance filling the gaps in their conversation. Finally, Helen turned to him, her expression softening. "I heard about your wife. I'm sorry." Russell nodded, his voice gruff. "She was a good woman. And you? Your husband?" Helen looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "It wasn't what I'd hoped for, but we made it work. For David." The weight of old regrets hung between them, unspoken, but palpable. Helen exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden she'd carried for years. "I never wanted to leave, you know." Russell glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "But you did." "Yes," she whispered, "and I've lived with that choice every day." Their words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of honesty that only comes when the past can no longer be ignored. Helen straightened, her voice gaining strength. "But we're not here to talk about us. We're here for them." Russell frowned slightly. "Alexis?" Helen nodded. "She reminds me of you, stubborn, determined, and too proud for her own good." Russell let out a soft chuckle. "Sounds about right." Helen's expression turned serious. "If David cares for her, and it's clear that he does, I don't want them to make the same mistakes we did. They deserve better." Russell leaned back, his gaze distant. They'll figure it out. Or they won't. That's up to them. Helen smiled faintly, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Maybe. However, I've discovered that a slight push in the correct direction can significantly impact outcomes. Unbeknownst to them, Alexis stood just around the corner, a forgotten cup of coffee cooling in her hand. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the quiet intensity of their exchange had rooted her in place. Their words stirred something deep within her, a mixture of understanding and a newfound respect for the burdens people carried, often in silence. As she stepped back into the waiting room, her mind raced. Whatever came next, she realized, wouldn't just be about mending what was broken. It would be about learning how to build something new together. The hospital room was quieter now, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, a steady reminder of the life that persisted within its walls. Alexis perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension from the night's events hadn't dissipated, but something in the room had shifted since Helen's visit. It was as though the air itself had softened, making space for the unspoken words that lingered between Alexis and David. David stirred, his eyes fluttering open, to find Alexis watching him. Her gaze was cautious, guarded, but there was no mistaking the concern beneath her furrowed brow. "You're still here," he said, his voice hoarse. Alexis shrugged, her expression neutral. "Someone has to make sure you don't do something stupid again." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Fair enough." Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, David broke it. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his tone low but firm. "About everything." Alexis leaned back slightly, her arms crossing defensively. "You've had plenty of chances to explain," she said, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "I know," he admitted, "and I've handled this all wrong. I thought, if I could just be someone else for a little while, someone simpler, maybe I could figure out what I really wanted. I didn't expect to meet you, Alexis, and when I did, I panicked." "Panic made you lie?" she asked, her words sharper now. David winced, not just from the accusation, but from the truth of it. "I was afraid," he said simply, "afraid you'd see me the way everyone else does, through the lens of my name, my money, my company. I didn't want that with you." Alexis studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what did you want?" David met her gaze, his own steady despite the vulnerability in his voice. "I wanted to be someone you could trust, someone you could see as more than just all the baggage I come with." Alexis's chest tightened at his words, though she kept her face composed. "Trust doesn't come easy, David, especially not when you start things off with lies." "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn it. I don't want to lose this. Lose you." Her heart ached at his sincerity, but the scars of betrayal weren't so easily soothed. "It's not that simple," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands. Before David could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. Helen stepped inside, her expression warm but purposeful. "Am I interrupting?" Alexis shook her head, grateful for the reprieve. "No, I was just about to step out." As she moved toward the door, Helen stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Alexis," she said softly, her eyes kind, "sometimes we have to let go of the past to make room for what's ahead. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Alexis hesitated, her gaze flicking between Helen and David. Finally, she nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving them alone. Helen pulled a chair closer to David's bedside, her demeanor shifting to something maternal, yet firm. "You've made quite a mess of things, haven't you?" she said, though there was no malice in her tone. David sighed. You could say that. Helen reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. She's a good woman, David. Strong, stubborn, and full of heart. Don't let your pride ruin this. I'm trying, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. But I don't know if it's enough. Helen reached out, placing a hand over his. Then don't waste time feeling sorry for yourself. Fix it. David's brow furrowed. It's not that simple. Love rarely is, Helen said, her voice tinged with an emotion that made David look at her more closely. But it's worth it. Don't make the mistake of letting fear dictate your choices. I've done that, and I've spent years wondering what might have been. David hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. You mean Russell? Helen's eyes clouded with a mix of regret and acceptance. Yes, we had something good once, but life pulled us apart. Don't let that happen to you and Alexis. Her words lingered, echoing in the quiet room as David nodded slowly. He lay back against the pillows, his mind racing. There was still so much to say, so much to fix. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Out in the hallway, Alexis leaned against the wall, Helen's words echoing in her mind. Maybe letting go wasn't about forgetting or forgiving all at once. Maybe it was about stepping forward, one truth at a time. And maybe, just maybe, David deserved the chance to take that step with her. In the next weeks, the Cicero Town Hall was packed to capacity, its modest space barely containing the anxious energy of the crowd. The residents murmured amongst themselves, their voices a mix of frustration and hope as they waited for the meeting to begin. At the front of the room, Alexis sat beside her father, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tension in her posture mirrored that of the room. David entered quietly, his ribs still sore, but his determination unshaken. His presence caused a ripple through the crowd, a few whispers reaching Alexis's ears, but she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. He approached the front of the hall, his steps measured, his face set with purpose. Thomas Price was already seated beside his attorney, a confident smirk on his lips. His posture exuded confidence, suggesting that the outcome of the meeting was certain. David's jaw tightened at the sight. The mayor, a weary man with a kind face, called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss Mr. Price's proposal for the industrial development of Cicero, he began, his voice steady but strained, and any concerns the community might have. Thomas stood first, his tone smooth as silk. Ladies and gentlemen, this project represents progress, jobs, infrastructure, a brighter future for Cicero. I understand change is difficult, but it's necessary for growth. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the room, and Alexis's fists clenched at her sides. Before Thomas could continue, David rose, his voice cutting through the noise. With all due respect, Mr. Price, David said, his tone calm but commanding. Your version of progress comes at the expense of this town's heart and its people. Thomas's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. And who are you to speak on behalf of Cicero? I'm someone who's seen the damage your so-called progress can do, David replied. He turned to face the crowd, his voice gaining strength. I've been where you are, facing a man like him, promising the world while taking everything that matters. But this time, we're not going to let that happen. David reached into his briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents. I have here proof of Mr. Price's unethical practices, false appraisals, manipulated contracts, and illegal coercion tactics. These documents have been submitted to the state attorney's office. If this project moves forward, legal action will follow. A collective gasp swept through the room. Thomas's expression hardened, his carefully maintained facade cracking. He rose, his voice sharp. You have no authority here, Shelton. No, David admitted, his eyes blazing. But the people of Cicero do, and they deserve to know the truth. The mayor took the documents, scanning them with a furrowed brow. He looked up, his voice steady. Mr. Price, these allegations are serious. Until they're fully investigated, this project is suspended. A wave of relief washed over the room, applause and cheers breaking out among the residents. Thomas glared at David, his jaw tight. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming out of the hall. David turned back to the crowd, his gaze searching for Alexis. She stood, her eyes fixed on him, a mix of disbelief and something softer lingering there. Slowly she approached, the din of the crowd fading around them. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both curiosity and caution. David hesitated, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I needed you to see. I'm not just the man who lied to you, Alexis. I'm the man who wants to make things right." Her walls, carefully built over weeks of betrayal and doubt, began to crack. "You didn't have to do this for me," she said. "I didn't," he admitted. "I did it for this town, for your dad, for everything you fought to protect. But mostly," his voice softened, "I did it because I care about you, more than I ever thought possible." Alexis averted her gaze, her emotions tumultuous. But, as she glanced around the room, at the relieved faces of her neighbors, her father's quiet smile, and the man standing before her, something shifted. "You still have a lot to prove," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. David nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Alexis allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could unite, against the challenges, against the history, and for a future worthy of their efforts. The late afternoon sun bathed Cicero's overlook in a golden light, the horizon painted with hues of orange and pink. Alexis stood near the edge, her arms resting on the weathered wooden railing. Below, the town stretched out in a quilt of rooftops and winding streets, peaceful and unassuming. The soft breeze carried the scent of pine and earth, mingling with the faint hum of distant cicadas. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her, and didn't need to turn to know it was David. His footsteps were slower than usual, still measured with caution from his injuries, but determined nonetheless. "I figured you'd be here," he said softly, stepping to her side. "It's my spot," Alexis replied, her voice even but lacking its usual sharpness. For a moment, they stood in silence, the view filling the gap between them. David finally broke it. "I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to prove I'm more than my mistakes." Alexis turned to him, her gaze steady, but softer now. "You've done more than I thought you would. You fought for this town, for the people here, for my dad. That means something." "I'd do it again," David said, his voice earnest. "For you, for your family, for everything this town stands for. I'm sorry it took so long for me to figure out what really matters." Alexis's lips quirked into the faintest of smiles. "You're starting to sound like a Cicero local." He chuckled lightly, leaning against the railing beside her. "Maybe there's something to this small-town life." The humor in his tone made her relax further, but the weight of their past still lingered. "I'm not saying I'm ready to forget everything," she said, her voice cautious. "But I'm starting to see that maybe, just maybe, you're not the man I thought you were." David looked at her, the sincerity in his gaze undeniable. "I don't want you to forget. I just want a chance to prove I can be better. For you. For us." Alexis held his gaze for a long moment, searching for the cracks, for anything that might undermine his words. But all she found was honesty. She nodded, her walls finally beginning to crumble. All right, let's proceed incrementally. A relieved smile broke across David's face, and for the first time, Alexis felt a flicker of hope. Fragile, but real. Back at the garage, Russell and Helen stood near the open doors, the setting sun casting long shadows across the space. Russell leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, while Helen adjusted her scarf, her expression contemplative. "Feels strange," Russell said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Seeing you back here." Helen smiled faintly. "It feels strange for me too. But it's nice." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, the years of distance between them softened by shared memories and mutual respect. Finally, Helen turned to him, her eyes warm. "We made our choices, Russell, and I think we've both done the best we could." Russell nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but it doesn't mean I don't wonder sometimes." Helen's smile grew wistful. "Me too. But that's why I want David and Alexis to have a better chance. No regrets, no what-ifs, just happiness." Russell looked at her, a flicker of gratitude passing across his weathered features. "They're stubborn, both of them, but maybe they'll figure it out." "They will," Helen said firmly, "because this time they have people like us to push them in the right direction." Russell chuckled. "Well, don't push too hard. Alexis is not one to be shoved." Helen laughed softly, the sound carrying into the warm evening air. "Neither is David. They'll figure it out. Together." Later that evening, Alexis and David returned to the garage. The soft light from inside spilled onto the gravel lot, casting a warm glow. Russell greeted them with a knowing smile, while Helen stood nearby, her expression proud. As Alexis stepped inside, she glanced back at David, who lingered for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the scene. This time, it wasn't the grandeur of skyscrapers or corporate boardrooms that filled him with purpose. It was this, the hum of the garage, the laughter of neighbors, and the quiet strength of the woman he was slowly beginning to win back. He took a deep breath and followed her inside, ready to face whatever came next. Together. That weekend, the garage buzzed with life, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Strings of lights hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the celebration. Tables laden with food and drinks were scattered around, and a small band played cheerful tunes in the corner. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect, authentically Cicero. The community had gathered to celebrate not only the garage's revitalization, but also the town's victory against Thomas Price. Russell moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging gruff but heartfelt thanks with neighbors. Helen stood near the refreshments table, her polished presence softened by a genuine smile as she engaged in conversation with a group of locals. Even herself was surprised by the way she looked at home. Alexis stood near the main garage bay, her hands resting on her hips as she took in the scene. The sight of the townsfolk mingling, her father's quiet pride, and the bustling life of the garage, once on the brink of ruin, filled her with a smile. "You've done something incredible here," David's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him, dressed casually, but still somehow looking slightly out of place amidst the grease-streaked crowd. Yet his expression was one of belonging. He held 2 glasses of lemonade, offering one to her. "Thanks," she said, taking the glass, "but this was a team effort." David shook his head, his gaze steady. "It wouldn't have happened without you. You're the heart of this place." Alexis felt a blush creep up her cheeks and quickly looked away. "Don't start getting sentimental on me, city boy." He chuckled, but his tone grew serious. "I mean it, Alexis. You've inspired me to see things differently, to think about what really matters." She met his eyes, and for once, she didn't feel the need to guard her emotions. "You've proven a lot, David. Not just to me, but to everyone here." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the music and laughter swirling around them. Then Alexis tilted her head toward the open bay doors. "Come on. I think we've earned some quiet." The overlook was as serene as ever, the town twinkling below like a constellation in miniature. The stars above seemed to stretch endlessly, unburdened by city lights. Alexis leaned against the familiar railing, sipping her lemonade, as David stood beside her. "This place really is something," David said, his voice reverent. "It's home," Alexis replied simply. David glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think I'll ever really fit in here?" Alexis smiled, a mix of mischief and warmth in her eyes. "You? The guy who took down Thomas Price and got half the town cheering? You're already halfway there." He laughed softly, setting his glass down on the railing. "You know, I used to think success was measured in deals closed and numbers on a screen. But here," he gestured toward the town below, "here it's different. It's about people, about community." Alexis's chest tightened, her defenses softening with every word. "You're not as much of an outsider as you think, David. You've earned your place." "And with you?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes serious. She hesitated, then turned to him fully. "With me. You've earned a chance. Just don't waste it." A smile broke across his face, one of relief and gratitude. "I won't." For a moment, they simply stood there, the vast sky above them and the small town below. Then David reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Alexis didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers intertwine with his, the gesture simple but significant. Together, they looked out over the town, the future stretching ahead like the endless stars above. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Alexis felt certain they could face it, united in love, in purpose, and in the quiet strength they'd found in each other. In the distance, the faint hum of laughter and music drifted up from the garage. Life in Cicero carried on, its heart steady and strong. And, for Alexis and David, it was just the beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.